Hi, Glenn here. Pardon me, I have a cold. But in spite of that, I want to say a few things to Christians who have or plan to have public debates or even just public conversations with atheists or skeptics of the Christian faith about Christianity, the existence of God, about faith and reason, atheism, and so on. Everything in that whole broad area. And you don't have to take my advice, but I think it's decent. I've tended not to have formal debates like those. The only public formal debates, and I mean, proper moderated debates, have been with other Christians on interesting subjects in theology, or at least interesting to me. But I've had quite a few less formal public conversations with skeptics as well, whether that's been on radio shows, on someone's podcast, somebody's YouTube channel, or whatever. And I've certainly consumed a fair number of those conversations that other people have had. So to other Christians who do this or who maybe want to start doing it, I know there is kind of a cottage industry of Christian intellectuals who engage in this kind of thing. I want to make some suggestions. Again, you don't have to take them on board, but I'll give them to you anyway. Firstly, it's really important to appreciate what debates are and what they are not. Public debates are not a measure of the truth. They are a measure of your skill, your knowledge, your memory, your quickness on your feet, and so on. These are all abilities. Debates are mostly a performance. And I don't say that as a negative thing. This is just what they are. Someone whose position is completely false or even immoral can wipe the floor with his or her opponent in a debate if they're good at it and if it just goes well for them on the day. And they'll still be wrong. Nothing's changed. Someone who always wins debates in defense of the same position is not necessarily right. They might just be a very good debater, or because they always argue for the same position, they've had lots of practice. And being right, this is important too, being right doesn't by itself mean that you're more likely to win a debate, or that God or the truth is on your side. It would be foolish to think that because the truth is on your side, God will bless you and you will win. During my time in academia, I spent quite a bit of time there at university. It became quite clear to me that there are some people who are spending an academic career justifying their rejection of God. And that might sound conspiratorial. I don't think it is. And they might not describe it that way. But that's what they're doing, and they've developed very sophisticated ways of doing that. I've said to others in the past that sometimes it takes a very good philosopher to be an intellectually serious atheist. Now, of course, there are bad philosophers who are atheists as well. That's partly a joke, but there is truth to it. If you, someone who is just confident that the truth will guide you to victory in a debate, decide to cross swords with somebody like that, you will lose. And you'll still have the truth and they'll still be wrong. Debates don't determine that. But only go into a debate if you're prepared to do well at debating. Secondly, and this is related to doing well in debating, prepare. Now that may seem obvious. Of course, it makes sense to make notes and prepare what you're going to say and consider the main objections to what you're going to say and prepare responses to those as well. But you can't be too well prepared. I'm going to expose myself here and share with you a time when I made a real oversight in this regard, so that I can illustrate what I mean. I was going over to the UK to speak at a conference, and I forget how this was arranged, but it was a while ago. Justin Brierley, who was at the time the host of the Unbelievable radio show, spoke with me about coming along and discussing the moral argument for God's existence, which is something that I have an interest in. Not a debate, not a formal debate, just a conversation. And he was going to find an atheist to come on the show and converse with me. And he told me a while later who it would be. It would be a fellow named Arif Ahmed. And I didn't know who he was. But I thought, okay, whatever, it doesn't matter. I'll just put together some notes and present the moral argument for theism. I knew how these things went based on previous conversations, or so I thought. I would present this argument where moral facts are grounded in God. The atheist, as I had seen before, would give some alternative accounts of how moral facts are grounded, and then we would challenge each other about whether or not each other's groundings were any good. So yeah, you could say that I prepared, but I overlooked one major thing. Shortly after the conversation had already begun in person, I discovered that the fellow that I was talking to, Arif, was not a moral realist. He didn't believe that there were any moral facts. And this whole conversation that I had planned out in my mind wasn't going to happen because it didn't make sense anymore. Much of my mental preparation went out the window. And that was really dumb of me. Now, everyone is wired differently. And I'm sure that there are people who are super quick on their feet and they could reorient themselves to this new conversation that they hadn't planned for. But that's not my neurology at all. I'm a planner. And once I suddenly realized that I was in a different conversation from the one that I had planned for, I couldn't quickly rewrite my approach. I sort of wandered through the conversation, making the occasional somewhat intelligent observation. I don't disagree with anything I said. Now, after the fact, of course, it was obvious what I might have said had I planned better. I wrote a couple of blog articles about that, which is all well and good, but the opportunity was largely wasted for me. The conversation should have been so much more productive. And of course, it doesn't just apply to debates with people who disagree with you. I'll take a slight diversion here. It's wise to prepare what you're going to say in response to related questions, even when you're going into a very friendly conversation, if it's public, if it's going on the record. I say that not because you might never have thought about the question, but because in the moment, you might just go blank, or you might go off script based on things that you've been thinking or reading or discussing. Here's what I mean. I'll share another example. One time I was on Brian Orton's podcast called Apologetics 316. Again, as it turns out, talking about the moral argument. That's just what I was asked about. And it went generally quite well. It was a thoroughly agreeable encounter. But there was a moment that I look back on and think, that's going to seem pretty weird to some people. We were talking about the way that God grounds moral facts, and there's no good natural grounding for them. And Brian asked me, well, why do moral facts need to be grounded? And there is a good standard way to answer that question, I think, by rehearsing some categories in metaethics. Moral claims are propositions. They could be true or false. They're not analytic truths. They're not true by definition. So they are synthetic truths, combining an action with the property of being right or wrong. So there's this property that exists. And what is it? Well, whatever it is, it's the basis of saying that acts are right or wrong. And there's more to say, of course, depending on time. You might say a little about moral naturalism versus non-naturalism, but that's the subject area. That's the territory that you would be discussing in answering the question. And that's where I really should have gone. Had I paused for a few moments, I would have had the good sense to go there. But I don't always have good sense. As it turns out, by sheer luck, I had been quite recently, in fact, just the night before, reading about these things called truth makers, which I won't go into now. I won't repeat that mistake. But truth maker theory is the idea that true propositions are true in virtue of some fact about being. Those things in the world make truth-bearing statements true. Look it up. It's not really relevant here. But one of the things that I'd been thinking quite a lot about was the truth makers of moral truths and what they are, and I found that very fascinating. So when I was asked this question, why do moral truths need to be grounded? Instead of pausing to put together a more standard answer, I just blurted out this rather tangential answer about truth makers because it was on my mind at the time. Well, everything has a truth maker, and so do moral facts, and it was was in no way something I really have any expertise on. I was just kind of obsessing about it at that moment. I was toying with it as an explanation, and I was treating this public encounter like a private conversation where I was just sharing what was on my mind, using it as a sounding board. But it wasn't. It was something that everyone, well, not everyone, but lots of people were going to listen to. And in an otherwise helpful presentation, or at least I think what I gave was a helpful presentation, that moment still stands out to me as a time where I really should have gone with something prepared, and would probably sound a bit weird to a lot of people, especially philosophers. But why is Glenn talking about truth makers? Well, Glenn was thinking about truth makers at the time. So, yeah, prepare. Number 3, don't take it too personally when you don't win. I put win in speech marks. Let it go. Let it go. That, what I just said, leads rather naturally to this piece of advice. If you do walk away from a conversation that you don't think went all that well for you, it's not the end of the world, right? It happens to lots of people. Depending on who you are, it might even be good for you. Let go of your ego. Remember that the point of these discussions, or I think what should be the point of these discussions, is ultimately to help people to become more open to Christ, or perhaps to help people who already believe in him to know God more and to serve him better in thought, word, and deed. That kind of seems like what these things should be about for Christians. Look, it's not about your reputation. That can be a bitter pill to swallow. You don't need to be viewed as some sort of undefeated champion for your apologetics ministry, if that's what it is, to go well. And who knows, even though on the whole that conversation didn't go well for you, there might have been someone who was genuinely listening, who heard you say just one thing that they hadn't heard before, and it got them thinking. Or you spoke to a particular issue that had been on their mind, and so they were helped. Remember, even if it didn't go well for you, your position didn't suddenly become false. Although maybe it's an indicator that some of your arguments could use some work, and maybe you need to work on some of the aspects of the things that you said. But debates and encounters like this are, to a very large extent, a performance. Remember that. What happens in any given encounter is about skill. Now look, it's going to be partly about evidence and arguments that are available to you, but partly it's just going to be about how the conversation goes on the day, whether or not you get thrown off by anything, how you're feeling, how good you are at this, and so on. Now, by all means, continue to evaluate whether or not you want to keep having these encounters, because not everyone is good at it or should do it, but let it go. Fourthly, counting my fingers, whether you win or not, you need to learn to ignore the unhelpful chatter. No matter how you think the debate or discussion went, you're going to have haters. And I know that word can be overused, saying to someone, oh, you're just a hater, dismissing even reasonable or charitable critics as haters. But sometimes it's accurate. Not that long ago, someone commented on one of the conversations that I had years ago and said Glenn offered literally no argument at all for his position, in spite of the fact that kind of obviously I started the discussion by offering an argument for my position. And that's just an example. And people say that kind of thing all the time. He gave literally no evidence for this or this or that or whatever, when that's just demonstrably untrue. What do you do in situations like that? Do you have to defend your honor? Do you pursue trollish comments like that down to the bitter end and try to convince people to take them back? No. You need to value your time and largely ignore them. If you want to offer just a brief demonstration for the sake of observers that what the person said is wrong and leave it there, fine. And that's actually what I did on that occasion. I left a link so that people could go and look at the argument that I offered, and I left it there. But ultimately, who knows why people make negative remarks like that? Maybe they're right, but maybe they're ideologically opposed to your position. Maybe you said something one time that annoyed them or got under their skin. Maybe you disagreed with them about something and they're having a jab back at you. Look, it doesn't matter. There's a proverb in the book of Proverbs, actually, chapter 26, that says, I didn't type this on my screen, I'm remembering it. Like a bird that flies around but doesn't land is a curse that is not deserved. You've got to let those comments fly over your head and just ignore them. There's a well-worn principle that you should never read the comments section because it's probably going to be a dumpster fire. And that applies here too. You have to ignore the negative chatter. You just have to. By all means, of course, talk to people that you trust about how you think it went. Listen to what they say and be open to hearing charitable criticism, even from other people who are listening. You just have to be discerning about what kind of criticism it is. And focus on maintaining your integrity in defending a position that is supported by good reasons. Ignore the chatter. Fifthly, and this one might be easy to forget, don't take it too personally when you win. Win. I've already said that you shouldn't take it too personally when you don't do very well in a debate or a discussion, but you also shouldn't take it too personally when you do well. Do you remember that debating is a performance, that it doesn't ultimately determine the truth, that sometimes you just have a bad day, the conversation might not go in as planned, it might go in directions that you weren't prepared for, so you didn't really show the strength of your position, and so on and so on. It's very easy to remember that stuff when you didn't do well and you're making excuses, right? But when it went well, you might be tempted to forget that that stuff applies to the other guy as well as you. And you might be tempted to think that you're an amazing debater and you've knocked out your opponent and your position is ironclad. And these examples are more fun to remember. I had a public discussion with Stephen Law some years ago about his evil God argument, which I thought was a really fascinating and enjoyable paper by him. And look, as far as the discussion goes, by any reasonable standard, I smashed him. And if you've heard this discussion, you'll know that. I've even seen Stephen Law say in public since then that it didn't go his way, and that was an understatement. I was prepared. I had read his argument carefully. I responded to all of its parts. I showed that it failed in every way because it was all fresh in my mind, and I was prepared for everything that he might have said. I had the ideal responses lined up, just ready to go, and it went well for me on the day in terms of how my words came together and so on. You know, the stars were aligned, and it went really well. But that's the point. Circumstances just came together on the day. I practiced the craft of debating about that particular issue, and the other guy didn't have a bad day, or it didn't seem like he did. The right questions came up that enabled me to offer good, snappy responses, and so on. That doesn't mean that I'm better or smarter than him. Maybe I'm not. It doesn't mean that I'm definitely right, although I think I am. In just the same way that you shouldn't beat yourself up when it doesn't go well, don't put yourself on a pedestal when it does go well. And I think that leads nicely to the next two pieces of advice. I think these are the most important. What I've said so far is hopefully important, but these two things are the most important, and I really want you to hear them. Number 6, be really honest with yourself about why you're doing this. We all want to think that we're honest. Being called a liar is like the worst thing ever. You calling me a liar? But a personal hobby horse of mine is the reality that we're often not honest, and we do lie to ourselves about ourselves and our motives all the time, every day. I want you to cut straight to the chase. Do you want to be famous? Do you? Do you want to be famous? At least famous in the world of apologetics and debates. Is that your goal? Do you just like arguing and dominating something? Is that a driver for you? Maybe you didn't like those questions. There's a good chance that your pride answers these questions before you can make an honest self-assessment. Why are you doing this? Why do you take part in public debates or contentious conversations? What motivates that? What does it feed in you when you do it? And don't answer too quickly, because we want to tell ourselves the story that makes us look good, or at least not look too bad. Questions about our motives are some of the most difficult to answer honestly. Try to step outside of yourself, not possible, I know, and be an observer. What does that observer see when they see you having these debates? Do they see somebody who is behaving in a wise, winsome way that displays insight into the issues that you're discussing and real concern for the people who receive what is said? Do they see somebody in a rhetorical boxing match trying to score a knockout because that makes them feel good? Do they see a grifter, I like that word, a grifter trying to peddle his brand, make his blog famous, sell his books and so on? And here is where I would say that I don't think you should be gentle with yourself. Sometimes you should, not now. Be ruthless. I want you to examine yourself like an inquisitor. Don't trust your initial answers. You say that you're a Christian. Well, that's great. Do you love the person that you're debating or discussing this with? Do you want them to arrive at the truth about God and come to know him? Or minimally, do you have genuine concern for the people who listen to this person? Does it impact on their lives, their well-being, their relationship with God and with each other, so that you really believe that you're serving them? Plenty of us learn to think that we're not in this with an ego, or we're not just using it as an outlet for our desire to fight. And we want to attribute to ourselves the noble motives of love and concern for others, and of course our love of the truth and our valor in defending God's honor. But the next time you contemplate having a conversation or a debate like this, closely inspect yourself as you prepare, as you take part, and afterwards, as you reflect on the experience. Be very honest with yourself about why you're doing this. And lastly, that's my last big point, carefully consider whether or not you should be doing it. I want to tell you something that I think is true. There are lots of guys, and I don't mean people, I mean dudes, guys, who fancy themselves as apologists for the Christian faith. They might put warrior for Christ in their bio on social media. But as much as they might enjoy fighting with others and being disagreeable when talking about Christianity or atheism, they have only a modest amount of any relevant knowledge, not even the slightest bit of evidence that they are concerned about anybody's spiritual well-being, pretty much none of the social skills required to engage with people in a way that promotes listening, but they've somehow convinced themselves that they're right all the time, that they're doing the Lord's work while they turn people off the Christian faith. You think that's a bad example? Well, I don't, but okay. There are people, yes, guys, who run and possibly even make a living from apologetics ministries who have no business being there, because they're trying to engage not just in defenses of the truth of the Christian faith, but also against Christians whose theology they don't share, while they lack much or any formal training in theology and definitely lack the grace and skill to engage with those other Christians or talk about them in a way that is appropriate. And no, I'm not going to name anyone, but they're out there, and you probably have seen some of them in action. Now, if you have been brutally honest with yourself about why you're doing apologetics, why you want to have public conversations and debates about the faith, you've admitted to yourself that actually there have been some motives and some tendencies in your attitude that aren't good, then great, well done. That acknowledgement alone might turn the tide for you. But it also might be a good reason to step back from all of that, at least for a while. Focus on developing the character, the temperament, the knowledge, and the skills to have those conversations well. And it may be that once you've gained those things, you'll realize that actually it's not for you, and you're going to apply those things in another way. It might just be that you realize that having a reputation and as a debater and doing that sort of thing really isn't good for you. Never mind what other people should do. I said you. Maybe you've realized that it's not good for you. Maybe it fosters unhelpful attitudes in you. Maybe it encourages you to think that you're better or smarter than you really are. Maybe you'll see that your motives really are not that godly, to use some Christianese, and you should just leave it behind. For some years, and even now, I haven't taken part in those sort of confrontations. And it's not because I'm not good at it. I'm okay. I certainly have my moments. It's for a number of reasons, not all of which I need to share. Some of them are about stuff that goes on in here. But part of the reason is that whether it's obvious to the listener or not, I don't think it's been good for me sometimes. I really don't. The times when it wasn't good for me are actually the times when it seemed like it went really well. And that might be a surprise. I got the better of the other person, who was sometimes an atheist, sometimes a Christian, and there was probably nothing wrong with what I said. Maybe. I like to say that anyway. But I enjoyed it rather too much, that feeling of victory and trouncing the other person. And it's not healthy for me to grow that tendency, given what I think some of my personal vices are. Other reasons are that I have what I think is a pretty realistic view of human nature, and I think it's so rare to have people, whether debaters or audience members, it's so rare to have people really listen to points of view that clash with theirs, and to consider the evidence presented in a fair way, that there's often not much point to debates. And I'm really focusing on the negative now. Negative. I know that there are some debates that are wonderful, and I'm glad that they happened, but often there's just no point, I think. I don't want to dwell in despair about this, but honestly, I think that there are far more online arguments about God than there should be. But I pulled out because I didn't think it was, not completely pulled out, but I mostly pulled out because I didn't think it was helpful for me at the time. That doesn't mean you shouldn't do it, or that I will never do it. In fact, I did have, well, not really a debate, but a conversation recently online that broke that self-imposed rule. It was, I was chatting with Ben Watkins, an atheist, about the doctrine of hell. But the only reason that I was willing to do that is that in spite of, sorry Ben, his many bad arguments about atheism and Christianity, I kind of like him. I like him, and that's why I did it. He reminds me of a younger version of me, and he is younger than me. I'm not being condescending in saying that. That's why I agreed and made an exception. And in the right settings, I might have other public conversations with people on opposite sides of various divides in future. I'm not saying it's off the table for me, but listen. Don't take it as a given that this is something you should do if you have the opportunity and you think that you're a bright spark. I know, excuse me, I know what many might say, but the Bible says in 1 Peter 3:15, it's like the apologist equivalent of John 3:16, that you should be ready to give a defense or an account to anyone who asks the reason for the hope that you have within. Those magic words. And yeah, I know the Bible says that, but there is a world of difference between giving an answer to someone who knows you well enough to ask why you have hope and getting on stage for a combative spectacle. There really is. Listen, I'll sum up now. If you think that you want to do this, if you want to put yourself forward as the voice of truth in a public conversation about Christ, about Scripture, about the truth of a Christian worldview, about theology, and so on, then I want you to consider a few things. I'm going to offer you some filters to put this idea, this endeavor through. Constantly examine the motivations of your heart. I've already said this, but it's so important. Why are you doing this? You've got an imperfect window on your own motives, but as far as you can tell, when you think about it carefully, are you motivated by a real love of people and a hope that they will come to know God, and that harmful influences in their lives, such as harmful ideas, teachings, and behaviors, will be mitigated? Is that true of why you're doing this? Do you know your stuff? Don't be vain about this. It is too important. Do you know your stuff? How do you know that you know your stuff? Do you have any relevant qualifications in the subjects that you want to talk about? Be it theology, philosophy, church history, science, and so on. Have people who know you personally come to see through experience that you know this subject matter so well so that they will ask you if they have questions about it? Do any people who have significant disagreements with you nonetheless agree that you're a knowledgeable person in these areas? And if the answer is no, then look, of course, engage in conversations in everyday life about these things when they come up, as we all do, but know your limits. Don't let your ego get you out of your depth. Don't put yourself out there as an expert when you're not. Some of the most embarrassing things that I see out there on the internet are self-appointed apologetics scholars who don't even understand basic concepts like different views on God's relationship to time, or who can't accurately describe biological evolution, but they get into public wrangles about those very things and condemn other Christians who don't share their view on them when they have no expertise in those subjects. Next, are you a jerk? Are you a jerk? Do you ever find yourself wondering why so many of the people you talk to on the internet end up in hostile arguments with you, with nasty things being said? It's kind of like the guy who wonders why everyone else on the road is driving the wrong way. No, it's you. Ask people who know you and who have seen you in conversation with others. Am I a jerk? Am I reasonable? Do I escalate conversations into hostility? These things matter. You don't need just an intellect and some knowledge. You need the social skills and the temperament to engage with people who you're going to disagree with strongly. Are you willing to have trolls? No, I don't just mean people who disagree with you, people that you don't like. I mean people who set out to menace you. Are you willing for that to happen? This is a common feature of online life. All it takes is one thing that you've said about gender or social issues to go viral, like a TikTok video that gets thousands, hundreds of thousands, maybe even millions of views, and you can quickly become a target. Ask me how I know. And it's not fun. If you gain any sort of public profile standing up for things that rub people the wrong way intellectually, or perhaps more importantly, morally or spiritually, then you need to be prepared for the fact that you might attract the attention of bad actors, people who will treat you in ways that are wrong, perhaps harmful, maybe even illegal. Things like sending you unwanted messages and not stopping when you ask them to, obsessively commenting on everything you do, saying things about you online to others, in some cases impersonating you or impersonating other people when they contact you, or writing things online about you that are just basically untrue and damaging. I've seen all of these, and I've experienced some of them myself. And look, I'm practically a nobody. And yet these sorts of things, some of them anyway, have happened to me, and they've certainly happened to people I know. You might be lucky. You might be lucky. But you have to be ready for the fact that there are people out there who use less than savory tactics. Is what you want to do important enough that you can live with that? If not, well then don't do it. Lastly, for now anyway, when's the last time, and I'm not leaving it to last because it's an afterthought, it's maybe the most important thing. When is the last time that you prayed for wisdom, for discernment about doing this? Or if you've already started doing this, do you pray for wisdom and for guidance as you prepare for each encounter? If you can't think of a time, or you're not sure if you did this the last time you had a public engagement, then don't do this. And I don't think I'm overstating it. Stop. Stop planning to do this entirely. And I don't mean pause for a couple of months, right? So you can quickly get into the habit of praying. I mean, put the whole idea to one side and work on yourself for a while. I know you don't have to take my advice, but please do. this type of encounter is not like just talking about maths or talking about economics. If you're not, and I have to say, I'm not at all suggesting that praying about a debate will make it go your way, and that's why you need to do it. No, that's not true at all. But if you're not intentionally bringing this whole endeavor and each encounter before God in prayer, then something's wrong. That's a canary in a coal mine, or at least it should be. It's a measure of where you're at and of what this whole enterprise is about for you. It might be said, I thought of this last night, and I thought, is that an overstatement? No, I don't think it is. It might be said that prayer is not just a useful addition to the Christian life. In a major way, prayer is the Christian life. It's a rudder that keeps you on course. It reminds you of who you are and of what you are in the world. It focuses your activities on their ultimate purpose in God's service. And I say these things fully aware that I'm no amazing prayer warrior, as some might call themselves. Some people might even think I'm shocking. But listen, I've never approached any of the public debates or discussions that I've had about God or the faith without first taking time in prayer to ask for wisdom, to ask for humility, to ask God to use the event to bring him glory, and if possible, to draw people to him. And I think one of the most important measures, one of the most important symptoms of whether or not you should be doing this is whether or not you bring these discussions or debates to God in prayer before you go out in public and have them. If you're not, then don't do it. There you go. That's it. That's what I wanted to say to other Christians who are involved in or who are thinking about getting involved in debates or public discussions about the faith. Now, this is just my perspective. And as I've said already, I'm practically a nobody. You might not agree with everything I've said, and your feedback is welcome. There is a comment section here that you're welcome to use, but I do hope that it's useful.